Hello Internet, Yulia speaking, and I love languages, and I also love reading. So for me, it's pretty important to sort of combine the two, which means that my TBR has quite a few international books, so books written in foreign languages. Now, I didn't actually read all of these, hence why they're in my TBR and not my read list. But I thought it would be nice to just talk a little bit about them, and maybe that would spur me on to finally get to these books and read them. Now, my TBR pile is ginormous, so I think we're only gonna talk about the first 10 books in it to cut this down a little bit so that this isn't a million years long. But by books, I do mean sort of series. So if it's a standalone, that takes up one spot, but if it's a series, I'm gonna make that take up one spot as well, because some of these are pretty long sets of books, so it would just take up the whole 10. I'm also gonna try and include as many languages in here as possible, so you can see some variety if you wanna, study a language, and reading would obviously help. So that way you can get some options. First up here, I've got a German series, and the English translation is Ruby Red, Sapphire Blue, and Emerald Green. This series I actually did read, so it's not technically on my TBR, but we're gonna ignore that. I do know that it's really good, and I would definitely recommend you reading it, whether in German or the English translation, which I found is very hard to find, actually, especially if you're trying to read it online. This is a series about time traveling, which is always fun. Gwen is in a family of time travelers where the gene is passed down the female line, and there's a similar family where the gene is passed down the male line. Her whole life, her family has been preparing her cousin to acquire this gene and become this time traveler in this secret society that they're all kind of a part of, but don't really know what's going on unless you're already in it. But as it happens, on her 16th birthday, Gwen is actually the one that travels back in time, and it's about this whole story and adventure of her figuring out how this whole thing works, understanding this whole hidden society, and trying to get through traveling into the past without having years of experience, because they've been preparing the wrong person to know how to dance and know how to act and just, survive in all of these past centuries. Next up, I'm moving on to a Russian series that's on my TBR, and there are quite a few of those because I'm really trying to work on my Russian, because it can be upsetting when it's your own language and you feel like you can't speak it as well as a native should. So I actually have the physical copy of this book. Found it. This one is Metro 2033, which I think translates to Metro 2033, literally. I don't properly know what this is about. I get the feeling that it's got something to do with the year 2033. Yeah, so it's a dystopian sort of thing. I think it has something to do with the metro, the underground, as the title says. We're just going from the image we're getting here right now. But I know that my parents have read it and they really liked it, and I know it's got lots of good reviews, so I thought, dystopian is the sort of thing I normally read, so why not try it in Russian? Because generally the problem that I have with making myself read in Russian is because if the story is not interesting enough for me to get past my lack of vocabulary, I'm not gonna read it. So let's hope this is a good one. Number 3 is also a Russian one. As I said, there are quite a few Russian ones here, but this one I found myself and I'm quite happy about it. It's called, the whole series is called The Lonely Demon, so Одинокий демон, and that's just my personal translation. I'm gonna put the picture here, and if I find an English version, I'll put a link to it. But what I got from here, it's just about the adventures of this demon, but what really hooked me on is I read a tiny sample of it, and it's the voice of the main character. It's just so funny, and I have never found that in a Russian book, because I've always, as I said, it's always happened that I've been quite bored, and I feel probably it was the books that I picked up, so I'm sure there's lots of other books that like are really good. But here I was just so curious to know more about this character that talks in such a like sassy and witty way, and there's just so much sarcasm, and it's fantasy sort of thing, so yeah, hopefully I'll really like it, and so will you. This next book I think is written in Portuguese because it looks very much like Spanish, but I still don't understand it, so that's how I normally figure out that something is Portuguese. The English translation is Death with Interruptions, and I know this one has something to do with time, and I think something happens and people just stop dying, and it's about how that whole thing, like, that's just the main concept, and as I said, like, I haven't read it, so I don't know where the story goes or how that works out, but the idea, like, that concept is just really interesting to me, and I really want to read that. I would probably read it either in English or in Russian because there are both translations, because as I said, I don't speak Portuguese. But for any of you out there that do speak Portuguese, like, that sounds like a really interesting thing to look into. Number 5 is a French graphic novel. Oh, do I have it here? I always forget how many gems I've got hidden around my childhood bedroom. So this is the French series, and they're graphic novels, and it's called Le Château des Étoiles, and I think that means it's the Castle of Stars, but if I'm wrong, I'll put the actual English title in here somewhere. It's really beautiful, like the art style, I love it so much. Do you see how pretty that is? And the fact that it's a graphic novel is going to be really helpful with the French because, you know, less to read. So yeah, this is a really interesting one that I want to look into. And it helps both things, like I can read more in foreign languages and I can also read more graphic novels. What's not to like? Number 6 on my list is El Cementerio de los Libros Olvidados, which is the Cemetery of Forgotten Books. It sounds very mysterious, about a boy who wakes up one day not remembering his mother's face, and something about rare book dealers and his dad kind of showing him that society of people discussing forgotten books. I'm not making it sound interesting, but it does seem very mysterious, and I do want to read it, and it is in Spanish, so that would be really good because I haven't spoken it in 2 years and it's kind of making me forget everything. Number 7 is another graphic novel series, this time in Russian, and it's called Exlibrium, and I'm pretty sure the translation is pretty much the same because I don't think that's actually a word, although who knows, I may be wrong. And the premise kind of talks about this girl who is essentially a big nerd, and she just one day starts bumping into all these fictional characters, and that's kind of all you get, and honestly I'm already hooked, so what's really not to like there? Next one, so number 8, is another French one, and it's called La Femme au Carnet Rouge. In English it's called The Red Notebook, and this is about a guy that starts falling in love with a girl because he finds her diary, a red notebook, and starts reading it, which again sounds like a really interesting concept, and I wonder how that's written, if it's like shows pieces of the diary and his reactions to it or not, and things like that, and if they actually meet at the end. So that's all very curious to me, and I really want to read it for that reason, and also the French practice, that doesn't hurt. Next up is a Spanish book called El Paso de la hélice, and I don't actually think this has an English translation because I haven't been able to find it. Literal translation is something along the lines of the passage of the propeller, which makes no sense to me, and I'm sorry for all those readers that don't speak any of the languages that it's been translated into. The Russian translation of it is без обратного адреса, which basically means without a return address, which kind of makes more sense to me. So it's basically about this book that gets delivered to this publishing company every year, and it's like every year you get a continuation of the book, and it's all by an anonymous author, but then one year the author doesn't send the continuation, and the people are kind of like getting really mad, but no one can do anything about it because the author is anonymous, and basically this guy gets sent out to find it, try and figure out who this author is, and basically try and make the people happy, which sounds like a really fun story, and It is in Spanish, and the translations that I found, I think there's Chinese, Russian, and like Czech or something. So I'm sorry if you can't actually read this one. And finally, I want to end on another Russian book, and again, I'm really sorry, but this actually has no translations, so if you're not interested in learning Russian, or if you're like, if you don't speak it yourself, I'm sorry, but you probably can't get to this book. But in Russian, it's called Я уеду жить в свитер, which literally translated means I'm leaving and going to live in my jumper. And it's just about this girl that's basically, this girl is sort of forced into a friendship with someone else, and the only time she's got to escape from this is this like coffee shop that she goes to called the Jumper, essentially, or the Sweater. I don't know, it depends how you want to translate it, I guess. And I don't know, from the cover and everything, it sounds like it's gonna be really cute and kind of life related, and hopefully really nice and relaxing for when I'm in the mood for something like that and want to practice my Russian. So those were my 10 international TBR books, with the exception of the Ruby Red trilogy. Thank you for watching. I hope you got inspired to read some foreign language books, and yeah, see you next time. End of rant.